At this point in the course, we have just spent about 7 sessions talking about the way we learn different whats: languages, motor skills, spatial layouts, storytelling, and knowledge in math and science domains. In all of these cases, the different whats combine both skills and knowledge, but they emphasize one or the other more so. For example, in language and motor skills, skills like being able to speak or being able to dance or move are emphasized a little bit over knowledge, and in math and science, we might emphasize knowledge a little bit over the skill of how to actually do, say, science. And in all of these cases, learning the skills and the knowledge involved both deliberate effort, conscious efforts at learning, but also more subconscious processes in learning. Now, what I would like to do in this lecture is to consider how these different domains of learning can be integrated and where they might be distinct. And we'll do this in 2 ways. First, we'll consider some broad dimensions or principles along which different types of learning can be considered. Second, we will discuss some theories about learning as involving 2 types of mental processes, along with the interplay of those processes. We'll look at some of the evidence for those theories. And finally, I'll close with strategies for learning that appear to generalize, that is, strategies that will be effective in different types of learning tasks. I'll also cover one additional behavior that's been shown to facilitate learning in many of these different domains: getting a good night's sleep. On the surface, it may seem like the way we learn motor skills and the way we learn to speak have little in common, and even less in common with how we learn about science or storytelling. But here are some organizing themes. These are ways in which learning across different content areas is similar, and some ways in which learning may be distinct. First, and this is probably not going to shock you, repetition is critical to most types of learning in most cases. People learn by repeating things. They learn by being repeatedly exposed to information, or by repeatedly making an effort to try out a movement or to find their way from point A to point B. Now, learning can also be more specific and limited than we'd like. For example, when we learn a motor skill, it's important that a variable skill, like being able to catch a ball, be practiced under varying conditions. Otherwise, we can get pretty good at catching a very specific type of throw, but not the wide range of throws that might occur during a dynamically evolving game. Now, if we need to make use, for example, of the ability to engage in good scientific reasoning, we can do that maybe in our domain of science, but we might not always do it in an area where we'd rather not revise our opinions or expend the effort. Learning also depends on prior knowledge, and this is true in virtually every single domain we examined, whether or not we emphasized it at the time. We talked about how babies use built-in, evolutionarily based prior knowledge about objects, about space, and they even use evolutionarily based prior knowledge about how muscles move to begin to make sense of their worlds and to begin to move within those worlds. And they do this from birth and maybe even earlier on through adulthood. Prior knowledge can also lead us astray, as we discussed in the case of confirmation biases. It can make it difficult or less easy to learn specific new things, like particular sounds in a second language. And this issue of prior knowledge is really critical, and we're going to be revisiting this issue in other ways throughout the rest of the course. Learning can also happen with and without our awareness, and this is also true in virtually any domain we've discussed. But here is a place where different domains of learning might differentially emphasize one kind of process versus another. As it turns out, theorists have proposed 2 different sets of processes by which people perceive and learn about their worlds. I'm going to talk about these as 2 processes, but remember that in each case, we may be talking about a whole set of similar processes, not just one kind of process. So the first type of process is a low-effort, often unconscious or implicit process that tracks associations between events. It's this kind of process by which babies recognize regularities in the way sounds happen in their language. And it's this kind of process by which the motor system makes fine-tuned corrections to your movements as you learn to play a particular piece on the piano. This is also the kind of process by which basic aspects of learning to tell stories are likely to be learned. By doing stories over and over again with expert partners, you come to just know how a story ought to be told under various situations. It's also this kind of process that may be involved in updating your map of your city when you don't really try to do so. You're not really effortfully trying to learn your city. You only realize that you've learned in this way when suddenly you know there's a shortcut you can take. And it's this kind of non-conscious process that nods and accepts when we hear confirming evidence about our theories of the world, and that does that accepting without thinking, how good is this evidence really? Let's call this kind of process System 1 for learning. System 1 is fast, it's intuitive, and it can process a whole lot of information without a conscious thought or a deliberate care from us. System 1 is related to the idea of intuition, of knowing or having a hunch without knowing quite why we have that intuition. And again, recent work shows this is not just a single system. It's likely a host of different systems that operate quite similarly, quickly, efficiently, and importantly for us, outside conscious awareness. The second process is a deliberate, conscious, and somewhat effortful one. Every time you furrow your brow to try to figure out what a word means, or how the model of the circulatory system that you're looking at in this textbook figure actually doesn't fit with what you thought was true, in those cases, you're engaging this learning process. Every time you sit down to study a list of foreign vocabulary words, you are engaging this process. When you try to think through a route you took and your existing model of how your city's laid out and put them together to describe to yourself, in fact, how your city's laid out and how the route fits within that model, you're using this process to learn about your surroundings. We'll call this one System 2. It is often described as slow, and it has what people would call low capacity. And what I mean by that is there are limits to how much we can learn at any given moment in time within this system. And again, it may be possible to think of this as multiple systems as well. These two processes are not unique to learning. Rather, they've been proposed across an enormous range of activities in which human beings and other species engage. They've been proposed to occur in memory, attention, social cognition, reasoning, and decision-making. So, what is the evidence we have about these two processes? What I want to do next is to consider some of that evidence by moving out from learning a little bit and talking about a couple other areas, and then we'll bring it back to learning and consider the merits and costs of each of these systems. And we'll also think a little bit about where they intersect. Evidence for the two systems comes from a variety of areas, but let's consider just two: visual perception and memory. In visual perception, System 1 provides for attention to the environment broadly, non-specifically, and it allows us to pick up a lot of different stimuli in that environment. By contrast, System 2 looks at a scene in a goal-driven way. It notes and recognizes specific, desirable objects or pieces of information. So consider driving. System 1 lets you generally monitor other vehicles and traffic flow without consciously paying a lot of attention to that. In fact, you're generally not aware of paying attention to traffic flow unless something gets disruptive and you need to respond to it. System 2, in the meantime, is looking for signs for your desired exit and considering whether there's going to be a traffic problem on Foothill Drive at this time of day. These two systems have been shown with neuroimaging studies. That is, different areas of the brain are involved in those two different kinds of visual attention. And also, if we look at people who have specific damage to particular areas in the brain, damage in areas related to one system disrupts that system, but not the other system. Another example comes from recognition memory. In studies of recognition memory, the task is to say whether or not something has been seen before or whether something is new. Now, people's judgments of recognizing something can be based on a type 1 system feeling of familiarity, a sense that, that's familiar to me. They can also be based on a type 2 system actual recall of having seen the item. I remember the moment where that word flashed on the screen. Both types of information, familiarity and recall, contribute to when we say that we recognize something. Yeah, I've seen that before. However, when researchers look at the different contributions of the two systems, for example, by asking people who say they recognize a word, do you remember seeing the word, or do you just kind of know that you saw it? They get some revealing information. As one example, in the false memory studies that we talked about earlier, when we talked about hearing a list of words like bed, nighttime, brushing your teeth, and things like that, and how people often falsely remember seeing the word sleep. What actually happens is that for many people, they just kind of know that they saw the word sleep, but they don't actually remember seeing it there. So system 1 is actually fooling you in that case. System 1 is telling you sleep must have been in there. And if, in fact, on a recognition test, you restrict yourself to items that people say, I actually recall seeing that word in the list, you'll get lower performance. So one way to think about this is System 1 lets us recognize a lot more information than System 2 does, but at some cost. Now, looking at people or circumstances that make deliberate recall hard also tells us that that deliberate recall, System 2, and that familiarity, System 1, are two distinct systems. For example, age differences in recognition memory can be teased apart by using this approach. What researchers find is that people's familiarity, their System 1 memory, is preserved, but their ability to engage in System 2 recall is diminished with age and adulthood. That is, older adults are not as good at that kind of recall as younger adults are. And as with visual attention, these two systems involve different areas of the brain in neuroimaging studies as well. So how do these two systems or kinds of processes interact? Well, one proposal from reasoning and decision-making work is that when these two processes would result in different outcomes in a different decision, we get a chance to override default intuitions based on System 1 by engaging in deliberate, effortful involvement of type 2 processing. In essence, this is the kind of way that people can overcome confirmation biases of the sort we discussed in the last lecture. But I think it's safe to say these systems also interact all the time in many other contexts. So when you try to make a new sentence in a foreign language, if you've been immersed, many of your errors will be apparent to you, in part because of type 2 processing, but in part because of type 1 learning that tells you what sounds right and doesn't sound right. And it's type 2 processing that then comes into play as you deliberately and effortfully correct your sentence. As we move on to the next section of the course, we will more often look at factors like how we are learning and why. And in some cases, these factors, the how and why of learning, involve precisely the kinds of System 2 processes and the way they can be engaged in our learning experiences to hopefully enhance our learning. Let's turn now to the idea of putting all this into practice. What have we already seen that we can use to help us in learning? Well, practice and rehearsal support learning, and that's probably not news to you, but you can also be smart about how you use practice and rehearsal. If you consider spatial learning, motor learning, and even learning to tell stories, it's important to practice and rehearse in particular ways. So here I want to talk about some ways of practicing that are good across many types of learning. Practice and rehearsal that is spaced in time, that is, not all right before you get tested on your learning, but in small increments and happening every so often, with space in between, turns out to be more effective. This is true for reviewing vocabulary words. It's also true for learning to play musical pieces or even developing a new spatial map of a new town. Now, why this works is actually pretty interesting. Researchers like Robert Bjork think that our minds and brains have evolved to learn and retain skills and information that we have to use over a longer period of time. That is, we've evolved not to waste a lot of energy retaining what's going to be used only one time. Spacing rehearsals over time with days in between appears to make it clearer to the brain and the mind that we can't lose track of a skill or ability because we're going to keep needing it in the future. Now, we also know that elaborative encoding works, but what does that mean about learning and practice? Well, in part it means connecting to what we already know, either deliberately by thinking about how information connects to past things we've learned or to personal experiences, or also implicitly, as when we're learning a motor skill and our body automatically makes use of past movement patterns to generate and learn a new movement pattern. The role of prior knowledge also means that it's not surprising when studies find that we learn better with information presented in more than one modality. If we both see and hear information, for example, or in motor and spatial learning, if we see our movements on a map and also experience our movement in real time with sensory perceptual feedback, we learn better. This is part of elaborative encoding, and it increases the prior knowledge connections that we can make. Now, it also means that practice and rehearsal that's variable rather than precisely the same is going to work better for learning in most cases. Variable practice means you learn material in ways that are more easily accessible across a variety of situations. So, studying and retrieving your vocabulary words in different contexts, different settings, and in different ways is important. You don't always want to review your Spanish at the kitchen table by going over flashcards. You want to try telling a friend the words you're learning while you're waiting to be seated at dinner. You want to try recognizing or finding familiar words in a Spanish novel. You want to look at the words in the morning, but also at night. Variable practice and rehearsal let you really learn things, not just temporarily memorize them for one kind of test. Sometimes this kind of variation even has unanticipated benefits. In fact, a recent study of category learning really promotes this idea of variability, even in the area of category learning, where we didn't actually talk about it, and for very little kids, in this case, 18-month-olds. Perry and their colleagues had 18-month-old kids learn categories by showing them examples and teaching them which examples went with what category. Now, half of the kids learned examples that were all very similar to one another. Half were taught with examples that varied quite a bit and weren't so similar to one another. Now, over time, all the kids in the study learned the categories for the examples they were shown. They were good at that, and human beings are good at that. But the kids who learned with examples that were more variable were better able to generalize the categories to new examples. That is, when they got a new example, they were better able to say which category it belonged to. They were also better able to use the categories for word learning over the same time frame. So in the end, their greater flexibility in the learning phase, seeing more variable examples, actually let those same kids learn more vocabulary words over the course of the study. Now, the point here is that variable learning helped kids learn the category itself better. That's what we know from the fact that they were able to correctly classify new examples. But it potentiated a number of other effects on their learning. It actually gave them some new ways of thinking about solid objects in terms of different shape categories than what they would normally have known. And it sped up their vocabulary learning because they had prior knowledge. They had these shape categories, and they could attach new labels, specific names of objects, to those category names. Well, we also need to remember transfer-appropriate encoding. Practice and rehearsal that correspond to how you're going to use your learning are going to be more effective than if you're practicing in a way that isn't related to how you will use that learning. Now, in most cases, this means you need to practice in ways that are like use. For things like motor learning, it means that although you can get some benefit from visualizing and observing, eventually you really are going to have to do the motor movement in order to get better, in order to learn it. You can also be strategic about the interplay of the two learning processes. For example, immersion probably aids second language learning because it involves that implicit statistical tracking system, System 1 learning. Even when you don't think you're actively learning the language because you're wandering around thinking your English language thoughts, in an environment where everyone around you is speaking another language, you're still picking up elements of that other language. To consider another example, Suzuki violin instruction involves having students listen to the pieces they're learning to play over and over and over and over again. Now, Interestingly, it's not that the child has to sit down and listen and pay attention like it's a homework assignment. Rather, the teacher says, just have it playing in the car when you're going to school. And this is because that kind of background listening uses System 1 to train the child's sense of the rhythm of the pieces and the melody of the pieces without having to force the child to pay lots of attention and invest hours and hours a day with more effortful System 2-like processes. Now, I just focused on a couple times when we may not use System 1 enough and we ought to make more use of System 1. Other situations call for more use of System 2 than might seem to happen kind of naturally. For example, when engaged in grappling with new evidence, should you stop eating gluten in order to lose weight, for example, you want to bring System 2 fully on board, because it's only System 2 types of thinking that's going to let you distinguish theory, the idea that gluten is somehow related to weight gain, from evidence, the actual findings of studies that look at this question. And it's only System 2 that will let you evaluate the quality of the evidence and make appropriate changes to your theories. Finally, after you learn and practice, make sure that you sleep on it. Because it turns out that it's sleep that allows your brain to finalize various neuronal connections that you forged through learning and practice. And this seems as good a point as any to end on. We have not talked about sleep thus far, but one of the best things you can do for learning may be to sleep before and also after you rehearse or practice or otherwise engage in learning. Sleep involves a change in people's states of consciousness, and you probably know that researchers have divided sleep into stages. REM sleep, characterized by rapid eye movements and a lot of brain activity, along with muscle paralysis, and then stage 1 and 2 being relatively light sleep that involves rapid brain waves, and stage 3 and 4 sleep involving what's called deep sleep and being characterized by quite slow brain waves. Now, people cycle through these stages of sleep in roughly 90-minute intervals, and REM sleep occurs throughout the night as well. Research shows that in the early half of the night, we spend more time in slow wave sleep, and in the latter half of the night, we spend time in stage 2 and REM sleep a bit more. And it turns out that REM and slow wave stages of sleep may be critical for learning. Now, some studies have looked at people trying to learn under conditions of sleep deprivation. For example, they ask people to learn lists of words after they haven't slept in 36 hours, as compared to a group of people who learn the same words, but after having had a normal night's sleep. And you're probably not surprised to know that learning is impaired under these circumstances. It takes people longer to acquire the words in the sleep-deprived group. If you look at words that vary in how emotional they are, it turns out it's especially difficult to learn neutral and positive words when you're tired. And these findings suggest that you should try to learn when you're well rested, if possible. Far more studies have looked at the role of sleep in consolidating learning. For example, once you've learned words, does sleep help you retain your learning longer? Does it improve memory? This can be studied by looking at a participant's memory for what they've learned after a delay and comparing participants where that delay includes a night of sleep or doesn't. In these studies, we find that everything favors sleep, and this is true across an enormous range of learning domains. Sleep appears to improve learning in areas as diverse as the retention of foreign vocabulary, the retention of learning motor sequences, and it even seems to improve people's ability to learn to discriminate between two different textures by touch. Also, and I found this particularly interesting myself, even sleep during the day can help, at least for motor and visual learning. And these findings come from studies which compare participants whose delay includes a short nap versus not including a nap. Now, one way this works is that your brain might be replaying learning, and particularly while you're doing REM sleep. And the way that researchers document this is that they look at images of brain activity during learning, and then they look again at images of the brain's activity during sleep, and particularly REM sleep. Some findings actually show that for motor learning, you can really see the relationship pretty directly. In other words, what happens is, while you're learning a motor task and practicing it, your brain shows certain patterns of activity, and this is activity in the motor cortex and in the visual cortex that's related to actually performing the motor action that you're trying to acquire. Then, during REM sleep, the brain replays those patterns. Now remember, you're paralyzed during REM sleep, and that turns out to be kind of important because otherwise you would be sort of doing the motor movement in your sleep. Because in REM sleep you're paralyzed, the brain can actually replay those motor patterns without you engaging in the movements. So it's quite like sleep is an extra rehearsal at the brain level. Now finally, you may have heard that you never make new neurons in the brain as an adult, that you get all your brain cells at birth. And this is another myth. Recent evidence really suggests this is not true. There's pretty good evidence that many animals generate new neurons well into old age, and human beings are not likely to be an exception. That is, it's pretty likely that we also do this. So we may be generating new neurons throughout our lives, and in particular, we may be generating new neurons in a location of the brain called the hippocampus. So why does the hippocampus matter so much here? Well, the hippocampus is an integrally important part of the brain for learning and memory. It appears to be involved in initial learning, and it's also involved in the transfer of our initial learning into lasting changes in the brain, that is, in the retention and storage of learning. Now, as it turns out, sleep deprivation, and that includes depriving people of both REM and stage 4 sleep, which you do by watching brainwaves on a monitor in a sleep laboratory and running in and waking people up when they hit a particular stage. This kind of sleep deprivation reduces the extent of building new neurons in the hippocampus after learning. It also disrupts the ability of those new neurons to develop into mature cells. So without building those neurons and without letting them mature, you're actually hampering your brain's ability to retain the things you're trying to learn. So to sum it up, space your rehearsal, spread it out. Make it variable, mix it up. Make it elaborative, draw the connections. Make it transfer appropriate, learn the way you're going to use your learning, and then sleep on it. Today, we've really focused on common factors across different whats in our emerging picture of learning. These common factors actually suggest something about how we might learn best. And the lecture today has attempted to integrate and summarize those principles along with some examples. Next, we're going to turn our attention to the circumstances of learning with a particular focus on how we learn, where, when, using what strategies and approaches. We'll begin by considering attention, working memory, and executive function. These are capacities to focus your perceptual system on specific parts of the environment and to think about those parts of the environment while not thinking about other things going on. They are, for example, related to your ability to focus on my voice, make sense of what I'm saying, and ignore the sound of the telephone ringing in your neighbor's house. Recall that we considered System 2 thinking today as one way we learn. We'll see that System 2 thinking depends critically on attention, working memory, and executive function. In the next lecture, we'll learn what those terms mean in more detail and how they contribute to learning. And in later lectures, we'll move on to consider the strategies and monitoring that abilities like attention, working memory, and executive function permit. And we'll move from that discussion to an exploration of motivation and emotion in learning.